we're very much looking forward to what you have to say during the time of Rome and the Christians of Persia, competition and cooperation. So please welcome.
So thanks very much for that introduction. The book, which was just mentioned, is a highly dense and extremely boring historiographical work, which doesn't make for pleasant reading. The historical texts that we have pertaining to late antique Iran are all extremely various. The sources are scattered over many languages, and very few are actually in Persian, and very few are contemporaneous with the time. So in order to sort out what is actually reliable or not requires a great deal of effort. But what I'm going to do today is to actually introduce the subject itself. I'm going to tell you about Persia in late antiquity, and I'm going to discuss the relationship between the two great powers of that era, which were Rome and Iran. And the way in is a discussion of the Christians of Iran, a sizable and growing minority population, which featured prominently in the foreign policy of both of the great powers. So that's the premise of today's talk. So we're going to start with some maps. This is roughly the height, you could say, of the Iranian Empire under the Sassanid dynasty in about the year 600 AD, corresponding to all the territory currently making up modern Iran, a bit further north into Central Asia, and further east into Afghanistan, Pakistan, in India, and of course you'll note all of what is now Iraq, or most of what is now Iraq, and the Caucasus were held by Iran, as well as this strip along the Arabian side of the Persian Gulf. The Sasanian Dynasty came virtually out of nowhere. They had a sudden and very aggressive rise in the early part of the 3rd century AD. Has anyone heard of the so-called crisis of the 3rd century in Roman history? Is everyone familiar with that topic? So this is really the worst possible time from the Roman perspective to have a rival power come out of nowhere and begin threatening them. The first king of the Sasanian dynasty was a chap by the name of Ardashir. He was a vassal to the king of Parthia. Everyone has heard of Parthia. Sort of when Crassus, met a bad end at the Battle of Carrhae, and the Parthians supposedly forced him to drink molten gold. That was them. So they were overthrown by Ardashir. And very suddenly, this new Iranian dynasty begins demanding back the territories once held under the first Persian monarchy founded by Cyrus. So very much a military and an ideological challenge to Rome. The two states shared a frontier beginning way up in the sort of beginning of the Caucasus Mountains. This is the Black Sea there, going right down into northern Arabia. The problem with this frontier is that it was very poorly defined, and you had a sort of homogeneous population, roughly the same sorts of people on both sides. They would have spoken the same languages, had roughly the same sorts of beliefs and outlook on life. And many of them probably would not have known which empire they belonged to. However, by the way, so this is modern Iraq. This is Baghdad. It's important to note that the Persian capital is near what is now Baghdad, so that what we now think of as Iraq was once the sort of economic and political heartland of the old Iranian Empire. Now, so as you can imagine, constant fighting between Iran and Rome throughout the 3rd century. And if we can believe our sources, it was mostly because of the territorial claims of Iran. However, in the year 298, something important happened. There was a treaty made after something of an embarrassing defeat of Iran. The Treaty of Nisibis, as it's called, in the year 298. Basically, that's the first attempt to define the frontier between the two powers and to regulate relations. There's a certain emphasis on trade in this agreement as well. So I will say that we probably don't have the full agreement. We probably don't have an accurate record of everything that was discussed. But what we do have, what has come down to us, suggests that the two powers were serious about actually trying to coexist after this point. And we have a very interesting statement put into the mouth of a Persian ambassador who, after almost 100 years of constant fighting with Rome and demanding territory be returned, he says, "It is obvious to all mankind that the Roman and Persian realms are, as it were, two lamps, and like eyes, one must be adorned by the radiance of the other, and they must not strive for one another's destruction," and so forth, meaning that Persia acknowledges Rome as an equal. I think it's likely that that's a genuine statement, and for those who are interested, it was pronounced to the envoys of the Emperor Diocletian. Now, there was one very important consequence of this treaty, which is that it allowed the spread northward within Roman territory of Syriac Christianity, which took root very quickly in Armenia and the Caucasus. And the simplest explanation for this is that all of the main roads were now northward from Mesopotamia were controlled by Rome, because the territorial arrangements after the treaty were greatly to Rome's advantage. So, does anyone know what happened after this? Anyone have an idea? Anyone familiar with Armenian history? So, what happened almost immediately after this is that the Armenian king, who's known in the West as Tiridates or Tirdat in Armenian, he became the first ruler to convert to Christianity, maybe not necessarily the first ruler, but the first important one in late antique history to convert to Christianity, and he was baptized, and he brought his state into the faith. Now, obviously, that's the account that favors the Christian side in Armenian history, and of course the party of King Tirdat. Not everyone suddenly became a Christian, but the official endorsement of the religion was a very important step in the history of Armenia, and it defined the Armenian identity, but it must be noted that some of the Armenian nobility didn't convert and held out. This is significant because for most of Armenian history, Armenia was well within the orbit of Iranian culture and politics. So the Armenians who favored the Iranian side might have seen Christianity as a sort of foreign influence and sort of a new and unheard of religion which they resisted. Now, of course, everyone knows that everyone thinks of Constantine as being the first Christian emperor. But the Armenian conversion happened first. The political consideration there was that Armenia, being a small state caught between two large powers, looked for some way of differentiating itself from the two. So the Christian religion seemed like the ticket at the time. However, when Constantine became a Christian and then the Roman state became increasingly more Christian, Iranian authorities would have looked at Armenia and thought of it as sort of being drawn further and further into the Roman orbit, and that would have been seen as an increasing threat to Iranian influence, not only in Armenia but also in the rest of the Caucasus, which was a sensitive region. Now, of course, there were other causes for warfare, but that was one of them. Throughout the 4th century, there was really quite savage fighting between the two powers. The memorable death of Julian the Apostate outside the walls of the Persian capital Ctesiphon occurred in this conflict. But I'll just to elaborate on this a little bit, Constantine was apparently, right before he died, he was planning on being baptized, apparently, whilst on a military campaign. And that campaign was supposed to be the final conquest and humiliation of Persia. And of course, he died before it happened, but apparently the plan was that he was going to go and beat up the Persians and then be baptized in the river Jordan and so forth, but that's unfortunately not the way it worked out for him. His successor, Constantius, and then Julian inherited the war, and eventually Iran won, and they succeeded in reversing the Treaty of Nisibis and making significant territorial gains under this chap here, Shapur II. Now, by the way, it's hard to make out because the relief is sort of mutilated, but this is probably Julian the Apostate being stepped on by the Persian king, and that's probably the prophet Zoroaster or maybe Ahura Mazda. It's hard to say, really. But anyway, the last known picture of Julian the Apostate there. Now, during the war, there was quite a savage persecution. Now, the later accounts that are not contemporaneous with this greatly exaggerate the nature and the sort of gory details of the persecution. But there was a persecution, and this is confirmed by a letter by the Syrian churchman Afrahat, and he talks about the destruction of churches and slaughter of martyrs and so forth. And this can be understood as part of the Iranian war effort against the Roman Empire, because ostensibly, I guess you could say the Iranian state viewed Iranian Christians as a sort of fifth column or something like that. And one thing we can observe about it is that they were probably quite numerous, and they were also probably at very high social levels, which gives you an idea of the spread of the and penetration of the Christian religion at the time. Now, during this war in the 4th century, there was a long period in which all hostilities stopped, and the Persian king retreated from the Roman front and had to deal with a very severe problem in the east. And I think this slide gives away what the problem was. Everyone's heard of Attila the Hun. His ancestors had already been a menace deep into Central Asia and as far as the Chinese were concerned, long before this. Right at the beginning of the 4th century, there was a genocide in China in which all the Huns were to be exterminated. They fled and suddenly appear on the eastern flank of the Iranian Empire and begin moving westward, and eventually they reach the Ukrainian steppe and push out the Goths. And the result of that was the Battle of Adrianople, which some may have heard of, in which the entire Eastern Roman army was destroyed, and the Emperor Valens himself perished. So that's just to give you an idea. And of course, then Attila himself does a great deal of damage. But just to give you an idea of the, I guess, the threat that these people posed, they appeared in Iran first and had to be sort of dealt with there. It took 10 years of constant fighting in the midst of this Roman war and probably diplomatic exchanges as well to get the Huns pacified. And when Shapur II returned to the Western Front, he was accompanied by some Hunnish allies. However, that was not the end of the problem. The Huns continued to bestride the two great powers in the north, and they didn't really cease to be a problem until the middle of the 6th century. Now, why am I telling you this? First of all, this is the Great Wall here. It was built to keep out the Huns long before they came to Iran. This is another example of a wall here in northern Britain. That's Hadrian's Wall. There's a map here. You can see sort of former Soviet Central Asia here. This would have been sort of, Hunnish territory as well, and they would have been moving sort of west. You can see Ukraine up there. This is the Caucasus, where they eventually set up shop as well. So they're basically sort of, the pressure coming down on northeastern Iran would have been quite keenly felt. This is closer up on the Caucasus, a very sensitive spot. Sensitive because if the Huns were sort of, up there beyond the mountains, if they ever came down, they would very easily do equal damage to both great powers. So there were two important consequences of this. First of all, the Iranian state began to fortify itself immensely on a scale with Imperial China and vastly surpassing any kind of linear barriers put up by Rome. This is the Caucasus here, and the Caspian over here. You have a series of enormous walls and fortifications that were put up beginning in the early 5th century. This is a reconstruction of one of them. This is I believe it's meant to be the harbor at Darband, which is here. You can still see ruins of it. This is an example of one of them here. Starting off in the sort of coastal area, these walls would go very far into the mountains, and you have enormous watchtowers and things like that that may give you some idea of the scale of the threat. But of course, there was also a wall on the other side of the Caspian. The Persian Empire built the largest wall in Western Eurasia. This is some sort of satellite map, I think, and this traces the course of the wall. It actually begins in the water and goes into the mountain range there. You can see, maybe hard to make out, but you can see the sort of indentation going along this would have been a wall, several, maybe at least 30 foot high. Large sort of barracks here for holding cavalry and so forth. This is much of what's left of it. So from this you can gauge the scale of the threat. But the other consequence was that suddenly the Iranian state decided that it would tolerate Christianity. And it would sort of make peace at almost any cost with their Roman antagonist in the West. And this necessitated a considerable ideological change. In the olden days, the first Sasanian kings called themselves Shahanshah Iran ud an Iran, meaning the king of kings of Iran and non-Iran. Basically, everywhere. So they could no longer really maintain that pretense as long as they had to acknowledge an equal in the West. And it became abundantly clear that neither power could really beat the other, and when it was essential to cooperate to defend a sort of what would you say, a mutual weakness on a sort of ill-defined frontier with the Caucasus up at the top and the Huns above that. The Roman religion came to be respected and tolerated. the Persian king at the time, his name was Yazdgerd I, he summoned a church council, just as Constantine had done, and as later emperors would do, in the year 410. Now, I think this is significant. Does anyone know what happened in the year 410? This was Alaric's sack of Rome, when it looked like the Roman world would probably collapse. Obviously, the East survived, but I'm sure they were perturbed in Constantinople as well. So you have a king sitting down with his churchmen, determining what the indigenous Iranian church is going to look like. And we actually still have the acts of this particular synod, and it's full of all sorts of fascinating things. The Persian king is declaring that he no longer has a problem with Christianity, and in order to get at the question why, he quotes the Proverbs. He says, "The king's heart is as a stream of water in the hands of the Lord, who can direct it whithersoever he will," which would have appealed to his Christian subjects. But we have even more alarming rhetoric. The Persian king says, we tolerate Christianity because East and West are one dominion under my monarchy. As if, there's no longer any significance or purpose to the Roman emperor and the established church there. And, relations improved. They were not always perfect, but when they got rocky, the king dispatched to Constantinople his ambassador, who also happened to be a Christian. He was also a doctor, incidentally, in order to assure the tranquility and reconciliation of the two empires which constitute the mighty supports of the world. Right? So we're now very, very far away from the idea that the Persian king, is entitled to rule, everywhere, and no longer any of this rhetoric about, give me back my ancestors' territory. This is a statement of, full and complete equality, which, when you think about it, in the context of this this imposing threat of the Huns, he's basically saying that it's up to us to, uphold the sort of civilized and sedentary order in the face of this onslaught. So some interesting things happened after this. You have one of the Roman emperors, Arcadius, who asks Yazdgerd to adopt his son, Theodosius II. Now, both Theodosius I and Theodosius II were not known for having a lax attitude to Christianity. So, this must have been a particularly significant gesture. Now, of course, we have two historians who disagree about it. Procopius says that it happened, and then Agathias says only Procopius says that it happened. So, but even if it had been mooted or discussed, I think that's still a considerable historical fact. This, by the way, is apparently what Arcadius looked like, and that's Theodosius II, when he was much older. And then the rumor, of course, grew up that Yazdgerd was so sympathetic to Christianity that he wanted to become one. Unfortunately, he died before he could. This is according to the church historian Socrates. Okay, so considerable change over the course of the roughly 3 centuries that the new Sasanian dynasty had been around. And the impetus, if you walk away from this with only one notion today, the impetus for the tolerance of Christianity was the appearance of a threat that was so great that both sedentary powers would have suffered from it. And of course, Christians were already numerous in Iran. Now, it wasn't all smooth sailing after that, because after the death of Yazdgerd, toward the end of Yazdgerd's reign, a group of enthusiasts destroyed a fire temple, and certain elements within the Iranian state wanted to wanted to crack down, to punish them. And it was relatively well resolved, but unfortunately this was the beginning of a renewal of persecution under the successors to Yezgard I. And if we can trust our sources, it was quite a savage persecution. It's actually, the persecution is mentioned without very much detail in St. Augustine's On the City of God. And he infers that because the persecution is so bad in Iran that Christendom is going to have to endure pain and suffering basically forever. An obscure writer called Cyril of Scythopolis describes a sort of campaign of terror whereby the Zoroastrian priesthood wanted to round up and kill all the Christians of Iran. But the substance of the persecution, which I think was the most fearsome, was that the bones of martyrs and the buried faithful were exhumed and sort of taken out of the ground and pulled out of churches. Now, does anyone want to hazard a guess why this was done?
It's a sacrilege for Zoroastrians to bury a corpse.
Exactly. So it was to basically reassert that this was meant to be a Zoroastrian empire and a Zoroastrian monarchy. They took a very dim view, apparently, of the cult of relics, and burial itself was a serious bone of contention between the state and the Christian minority. Incidentally, it remained that way after the Muslim conquest. Apparently, the subjugated Persians thought that it was just they couldn't bear the idea that Muslims were burying the dead. So this is sort of a long-standing thing. Now, the reaction to this persecution is particularly noteworthy, and it could be called the First Crusade, because this was the first. This was the sort of not really fully developed, but the sort of beginning of the idea of a religious war against Iran, which was to develop into quite an aggressive conflict later on. But you have the emperor's sister Pulcheria issuing these sort of propagandizing coins with the angel and carrying the cross, and apparently a large cross was put up at Golgotha in sympathy with the Christians of Iran, and apparently the soldiers' cloaks were emblazoned with crosses on them, as happened, in subsequent events which are actually called crusades. However, this war was brief. The two powers quickly came to a settlement and averted any sort of major bloodshed, because this was the moment at which Attila was really most threatening to the two powers. In fact, there's an interesting incident in one of the fragments of diplomatic history that's come down to us, where you have a group of Roman ambassadors talking about the threat that's posed by the Huns, and apparently they're sitting there praying that Attila will destroy the Iranian Empire, because apparently he was thinking about it. And then one of them pipes up and he says, "No, actually, I think that would actually be much worse for us. So let's not do that." So that's the context that sort of called off this war and recalled the two powers to greater cooperation. However, apparently I say "however" a lot, but I think it makes sense here. All was not well, though, in the Caucasus. The Armenian question was still sort of posing problems for both powers. They had tried to sort it out by actually partitioning Armenia at the end of the 4th century. but in both Iranian and in Roman Armenia, you had the same sort of people and the same division as to, you know, who was more sympathetic to Iran and to Rome, and who was a Christian and who was not. And in the middle of the 5th century, this erupted into a civil war, basically. If we can believe the Armenian historians, what prompted the civil war was the Iranian effort to impose Zoroastrianism and to make it uniform on everybody. And as the rebellion sort of took hold, the Christian side obviously rejected that. The Sasanian Empire intervened on the side of the Iranophile Armenians, and the Christian side was defeated at the so-called Battle of Avarair in the year 451. This is an illumination apparently depicting that battle. Maybe able to make out little elephants there. The Persians were very famous for bringing elephants to war. I don't know how they would have got through the mountains, but you know, apparently they did. And this is remembered to this day. It's still a holy day in the Armenian calendar. It's remembered as a sort of heroic defeat, because although they lost, they still managed to preserve their religion, which at the time came to be thought of as in the same light as the Maccabees, sort of, you know, going down to defeat, but still maintaining the integrity of their ancient religion. Now, even after this civil war, the whole Caucasus is horribly unstable, and it doesn't stop until the very end of the 5th century. You have parties of Huns sort of intervening on both sides. Georgia, or I guess Iberia at the time, is sort of up in arms as well. Several of the Iranian fortifications in the Caucasus fall into hostile hands, and it seems as though there's no possible way of bringing this region under control. But the Iranian state finally did at the end of the 5th century. And again, the impetus for doing so was a disastrous defeat of the Iranian army at the hands of the Hephthalite Huns. Hephthalite is the name of a dynasty or a clan or a ruling house, we might say, of the Huns, which set up shop basically in Afghanistan, a bit into Central Asia, northern India. The Persian king at the time, his name was Perose. He thought that he would settle the Hunnish problem once and for all. He waged 3 battles, died in the last one. The entire Iranian army was wiped out, and the Iranian state was subjected to a humiliating tribute. Now, how did Christianity in the Caucasus come to be tolerated? There was a civil war at the death of the king. Armenian troops were brought in. They intervened on the side of the eventual victor, and one of their conditions actually they had 2 important conditions for participating. One was that all fire temples be destroyed in Armenia, which seems a little bit unrealistic, but that was one of them, and the full and complete toleration of Caucasian Christianity. Okay, so that's basically the story of how Christianity came to be properly tolerated throughout the Iranian Empire, or at least if not fully tolerated, then it ceased to be viciously persecuted all the time. So I want to ask, does anyone know what sort of Christianity Persian Christianity was? Or does that seem like a crazy question? Syriac Christianity. And how would you describe what would they say about Jesus? How did they believe? What was their Christology like?
Nestorian.
They were Nestorians. So Nestorius was a former patriarch of Constantinople who just couldn't bring himself to say that God had been a baby and that Mary had given birth to God. He felt that some distinction needed to be made and of course he was completely wrong, but he felt that there, some distinction needed to be made between the divine and the divine Christ and the human Jesus. Okay, so why was that the nature of Persian Christianity? I'm sure we could think of many reasons, but there was a political reason. Because, I mean, this may be somewhat fanciful and sort of trumped up, but we have the historian Bar Hebraeus, who did a sort of ecclesiastical history of the East. And he draws our attention to the churchman Bar Soma. And apparently he said things like, unless the faith of the Christians in your dominions be separated from the faith of the Christians in the dominions of the Greeks, namely the Romans, their hearts and feelings shall never be loyal to you. And he said, if you give me the power, I shall make all Christians of your empire followers of Nestorius. So obviously Nestorian Christianity was important to Bar Soma for whatever reason. But the king agreed to do this in order to create an important ideological difference between the Christians in his empire and those of the Roman Empire.
Who's Bar Soma again?
He was a Syrian churchman who eventually became, I believe he eventually became the bishop of Seleucia Ctesiphon, but don't quote me on that. Now, so an ideological distinction was created. Modern historians will often say things like this was a great victory for the Persian king because it finally brought about the full and complete separation of the two churches of Rome and of Iran, and that it put him at the head of it. It put the Zoroastrian king at the head of it. Now, I don't entirely agree with that. I think that this was a bit of a mistake because it basically ruined the settlement under Yazdgard, whereby he could have claimed to be the temporal ruler of Christians on both sides of his border. Obviously, with this settlement, that was no longer possible. But, who knows? Now, jumping ahead to the 6th century. By the way, I think everyone knows that that's Justinian there, up there, in his younger, more youthful days, before he almost died of the plague. His rival, Khosrow I, is over here. There's sort of a mutilated coin here. We don't really know what he looked like. This is really the sort of, the 6th century is basically the, what would you say, the sort of high point of both the Cold and the Hot War between the two powers. And you have this sort of architectural, extreme grandiosity amongst both powers, and constantly one is trying to show the other one up in almost every conceivable way. They're constantly trying to outflank one another along the border, trying to gain even the smallest advantage, sort of like the Great Game or something like that. You even have a trade war in the Indian Ocean, and two very aggressive wars under Khosrow. Now, I won't get into the details there, but one of them was brought to an end in the year 562. This was a war that was fought out in the Caucasus in Lazica, or I guess technically it's sort of right below the Caucasus. Lazica is now part of Georgia. And this went on intermittently from 540. It began, just to give you an idea, a lot of these wars, they're fought on multiple fronts, so it's hard to say. Like the actual part in Lazica began a little bit after 540. But anyway, you have 22 years of constant warfare, interrupted briefly by the first outbreak of the bubonic plague in history, at least the first recorded one, in which Justinian almost dies. But anyway, this treaty of 562, which brought the war to an end, is the first one that actually mentions religious minorities. And specifically, you have the Roman ambassador basically demanding that the Iranian state promise to look after and cease to persecute their Christian minority, to allow the rights of burial, freedom of worship, and use of graves and so forth. And this treaty has survived fully intact in the fragments of a chap called Menander Protector. So to put this into perspective, you could say that this is yet another attempt and a more mature attempt to regulate the relationship between the two powers and to develop some kind of, you might say, international law. And at the center of it was the Christian minority in Iran. Now, let's just make some observations on that. Toward the end of the 6th century, when it's looking like there's going to be another war, the Persian king, who is still Khosrow I, he sends an ambassador to Constantinople, basically trying to avert the war under the successor to Justinian. And he says, basically, if you attack Iran, you're going to be attacking a nation of Christians, and you will be killing your co-religionists, and no good will come from that. And apparently the Roman emperor thought that was just preposterous and sent him off. But I think that although that's probably something of an exaggeration, because the exact word is that it was an object of universal belief. That's what the text says. I think that it's possible to imagine much less of a Zoroastrian monarchy and more of a Christian one. The king would, of course, still have been at least nominally Zoroastrian, and there's no real evidence that anyone ever converted, but it's at this period when suddenly these legends begin to crop up. Jesus had sent an apostle to the court of Ardashir, the first Sasanian monarch. Of course, the chronology is out by 200 and almost 200 years, but the substance of that myth is that the apostle converted the first Sasanian king after he had cured, or actually after he had brought back to life the king's horse, which had died. Which, for those of you who may be familiar with Zoroastrian lore, that is exactly how Zoroaster converted Goshtasp, the mythical king. You have stories of visions of Christ appearing to Sasanian kings when they're on the verge of besieging, a Christian city in the east, and the idea is, the people of the city had been bad, and that they deserved the chastisement of the Persian king. And there's even an anecdote in I forget what the source is. Joshua the Stylite, a Syrian writer, he records that the king Kavad asked to be taken on a tour of a large church. And he said, "Oh, who's that up there?" And he said, "Oh, that's Jesus." He said, "Oh, yes, I saw him last night." And he said that the city had rebelled, and you needed a good beating. And it's an interesting question where that sort of thing comes from. You could see it as the imagination of a churchman, or possibly as Iranian propaganda meant to keep Roman subjects in their place, perhaps. But this is near universal. You have even Armenian writers talking about kings who had, converted on their deathbeds, such as Khosrow I. And of course, at the very end of Sasanian history, you have the story of Khosrow II, who is forced, because of a palace coup, to flee to the Roman Emperor Maurice. And built into this story is an account of how he actually became a Christian in order to gain the sympathy of the Roman emperor, perhaps, and that he returned to returned to the throne with Roman help as a great friend and benefactor of both the Roman Empire and of Christianity. He took a Christian wife by the name of Shirin, who I think he probably had other wives too, but he took a Christian wife by the name of Shirin, and there's any number of legends celebrated in Persian poetry to this day about Khosrow and Shirin and their adventures and so forth. But of course, it was all too good to be true. The two powers quickly returned to a particularly violent and bloody warfare. Some of you have probably heard of Holy Cross Day, or the Feast of the Exaltation of the Cross. The King Khosrow II, after he decided that he would basically liquidate the Roman Empire and conquer it entirely, which he almost succeeded in doing, he had sacked Jerusalem and carried off the cross, ostensibly as a present for his wife. And it looked as though Constantinople itself would fall. That was basically the only remaining independent part of the Roman Empire at one point. However, the empire fought back, and as we all know, they won. They recovered much of their territory, but that was basically the end. And shortly thereafter, we have the rise of Islam. This is, of course, a true likeness of the war that was fought. You can see the cross there. And for those who are interested, this is from the Quran. This is the so-called Surat Ar-Rum, in which Muhammad is sort of commenting on this warfare. He says, قُلِبَتِ الرُّومُ فِي أَدْنَى الْأَرْضِ وَهُمَ مِنْ بَعْدِ غَلَبِهِمْ سَيَغْلَبُونَ. So he's saying that, yeah, Rome was beaten, but don't worry, they'll win. So, of course, the prophecy, if you just change the vowels, it can also mean the opposite. But so it would have worked out either way. But the point is that the conflict between Rome and Persia had taken on an increasingly religious tone, in part because of the sense that the Christian religion itself was threatened, and that Khosrow himself was a sort of pagan, antichrist-like figure. And this is, of course, after the Romans had restored him to his throne and after his apparent conversion. So you can see how political necessity sometimes changes things. But I guess you could say that the religious character of the war became it became so important and influential that all surrounding people on the fringes of the two great powers took notice, most famously Muhammad. And that brings us basically to the end. But I want to leave you with, I don't know, a final thought, I guess. I think Jerry Springer has the final thought. So these are Islamic coins of a very early type that have a kind of these sort of Roman-looking coins, but there's an Arabic, inscription on them, two sort of Byzantine-looking people there. And in place of a cross, there's a sort of mysterious pole. It's sort of a subject to debate as to what that actually is. And here you have an Iranian coin with a figure that looks sort of like the Persian king, and then you have a chap holding a sword, very sort of menacing-looking guy. But again, these are Islamic coins, but they're clearly trying to, perpetuate the idea of the sort of imperial status of the two powers and so forth. And I can't help but wonder myself whether the spread of Islam into Iran, or whether the idea of an Islamic Iran, it was actually made possible, or at least easier, by the first wave of Christian expansion into the empire. And I'll leave you with that thought and call it a day.